This workshop is one of 7 that is being run throughout October and November, taking this idea of positive tipping points and looking at various different themes within the climate system. So we've looked at already student activism and climate justice. And then next week, we'll be looking at social movements with the Transition Network. We'll be looking at businesses. We'll be looking at donor economics. And then we're having a final session to sort of wrap up and have a bit of an open space to pick up any of the threads that have emerged throughout those workshops. But it's all about taking this idea of positive tipping points and trying to apply it in practice. So this is a very live idea that is being studied by people all around the world and being put into practice all around the world. So I'm going to talk through what that means. So these 3 images kind of convey what's sort of most commonly thought about when we think about tipping points. Is they tend to be ecological in nature and they tend to be negative. So a lot of the attention around tipping points goes to ideas like this. So deforestation, biodiversity loss, glacial melt, or changes in weather and monsoon seasons, for example. So these are systems that can become unstable and can deteriorate quite quickly. So what we've seen is there's been lots of really interesting research been done. So this is a graph from some research done by David Armstrong Mackay from the University of Exeter, looking at a variety of potential tipping points that have been identified within ecological systems. So here we've got ice sheet collapse, we've got coral reef die-off, glacial melt, monsoon shifts, rainforest dieback, for example, and then looking at, with the current projected level of warming in the atmosphere, what are we likely to see in terms of these tipping points? When might we reach that moment when those impacts become unavoidable? And so that we're getting better and better at understanding how these tipping points work. However, this is not the only type of tipping point that can exist. It doesn't have to be ecological and it doesn't have to be negative. And last month, at the University of Exeter, we held a conference exploring what else is going on within this idea of tipping points. How do we shift from looking just at the crisis element of that to looking at how can these tipping points become moments of positive transformation? So lots of really interesting ideas coming out of that. But one of the key ideas that was emerging is this is a very new idea. It's been around for many, many years, but in terms of thinking about how this can be applied in practice, it's still quite new. So one of the key questions that came out of this conference was, so what do we do now? And that's what's led to this workshop and the other series, the series of wider workshops is, okay, so how do we take this idea and make it usable, make it practical? So that's what I want to talk through. And this is kind of the context, is this idea that as human beings, we tend to not be terribly good at dealing with complexity. We like to simplify things down to a point where we can just draw straight lines between them and say, okay, if we do this, then this thing is going to happen. And it's a very natural response to uncertainty, is to try and focus on what we can control. But the reality, if we want to talk about systemic change and want to understand what's going on in the world and how we can impact it, we really need to look at what's the reality of what's going on outside of that box that we sometimes put ourselves in. And as this person opening the door is noticing, it can be very complex and overwhelming. So this positive tipping points framework is really in essence an idea of how do we hold that complexity, acknowledge the complexity of the world. So food systems, for example, but not be paralyzed by that, not have to oversimplify it so much in order to act that we lose sight of the fact that there's a lot more going on than we can often see. So one example to kind of get us into this, I'll use this idea of within food systems, the idea of packaging. So this image represents a variety of kind of sustainable packaging options that have been emerging over the last few years, and we've certainly seen a huge increase in those. But if we want to understand what's going on with that change, where are we within that process, where is it likely to lead to, then we need to dig a little bit deeper. So it's not just good enough to think about it simply in terms of, okay, well, if we map the progress towards sustainable packaging against any particular variable, for example, the technology increasing or the customer behavior changing or the cost becoming more accessible. It's clearly a lot more complex than that. And if we look at it from an oversimplified perspective, it doesn't really help us understand where this might be going and what new system this might be leading us towards. And also, it might be happening in a very different way. It might not be happening in that linear way. There might be moments in this progress towards a better form of packaging where we suddenly get a lot better, or things suddenly go backwards. Or it might be that we see very little change for a long time and then a sudden increase towards a huge uptake in better and more responsible packaging solutions. So we don't know. And if we don't really understand the kind of change that is happening, as I say, it's very hard to then work out where is that going, what else is needed within that system to keep it on the right track and to make sure it doesn't tip into a system that we don't actually want. We've all heard stories of biodegradable packaging that's not actually biodegradable, for example. So what is it? What are the levers within that system that are pushing it somewhere? And are they pushing it to a place that is actually better than where we are now? And it's only through understanding how that change is occurring that we can really start to answer those questions. So to put it a little bit more of a detailed an example, and one where I think it's easier to identify that a tipping point has been reached. This is a very popular example, thinking about the uptake of electric vehicles in Norway. So what this graph is showing is the percentage of vehicles sold within that country, the percentage of them that are electric vehicles. So as you can see, Norway is way out in front, 64.5%, and all of the other countries are under 14. So when we start to think about, well, why is that the case? What can we learn from that might help other places make this change, if indeed this is a change we want to see? Then we need to think about, well, what's going on within that change, within that system? So one obvious example is the prices going down. So this is happening over time. This is fairly common. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But we see the price going down, so that makes that change more likely to happen. We're also seeing the quality going up. So electric vehicles are getting better. The batteries are lasting longer. The quality compared to a petrol or a diesel car is much more comparable, sometimes better in some instances. So that's another key factor. And as the quality goes up and the price goes down and more people start doing it, the desirability goes up. So we see that idea of, if you see more of them on the road, then it seems like a more viable option for ourselves. And so you can see how desirability starts to become a really key condition that relies on what's gone before, but helps keep that change moving, keep it escalating. And then accessibility. So once you have the technology there, what we also sometimes see is more technologies come in to support that original technology. So within this instance, that might be charging infrastructure, for example. So as more and more electric vehicles are bought, more charging sites are installed, the infrastructure becomes better and the accessibility for using those vehicles also increases. But these might all be things that could be happening in any one of these countries. So what is it about Norway that is particularly special? And one example is the fact that, as well as the price of the change going down, the cost of staying as things are is going up. So they've introduced various taxes that mean keeping a diesel or a petrol car becomes much more expensive. So that's a really specific intervention, which if they did that at the very beginning of this process, there would be potentially a lot of outcry to that. But the fact that that's been done after that infrastructure has been in place means it's a lot easier for that to then tip into a system where when people buy a new car, it is more often than not an electric one. So that's a really specific difference from Norway to the other countries. But there's clearly other things going on there. So again, this model is a really helpful way of breaking down what else is going on within that system. How do we really learn from that, rather than just picking and choosing things that we can see? Because then we might get into just noticing what we already expect to see. but how do we break that down and find out what actually is the difference there, and how can we learn from that in another system, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's packaging, whether it's anything else. And at this point, I want to bring in a really key element of this, which is the importance of not oversimplifying this idea. So it's not just a case of we can find that thing that's going to make the biggest difference and use that as a lever to shift the world, shift the whole system. It's really important that we understand what has gone in place before. So it's not just Norway bringing in some taxes on petrol and diesel cars, it's everything that's led up to that point as well. This is a quote that came from the conference we had in Exeter from Professor Frank Giles from the University of Manchester. I'm just going to read this out. I think this is a really important aspect. The thing that is really appealing to policymakers is the idea that we only have to do something really small and then we see these huge effects, which is pretty misleading because it's primarily the efforts leading up to the tipping point where a lot of effort will actually be needed. So yes, that trigger, that thing, that change is important. So that new policy or that new tax, but it's actually everything that has led up to that point. That is the thing where we really need to put our effort into. And it's only through looking at the system and looking at how that tipping is occurring can we really understand and focus on that, rather than potentially putting our attention into something that we might not have that much control over. So put into practice, this is at the very basic level, the idea of tipping points. So it's not a straight line. Basin A, this is the current dominant system where we are now, the status quo, the norm, but we want to move things into Basin B. So thinking again to those, your answers to that question earlier around what system do we want to tip into, all of those ideas are within Basin B, or maybe multiple basins there, if they're different systems. So it's not just a case of we move steadily along from one to the other. As you can see here, the principle is there's a lot of resistance to change. So that system state, we're trying to roll it up that hill, but you can imagine how hard that is. And it's about overcoming that resistance. And this idea of a tipping point is the moment where that resistance becomes momentum. So it stops being difficult to push the system, and then it starts picking up speed into Basin B. We don't have to do anything more to it. It kind of looks after itself. We might need to nudge it in the right direction, but it's that shift from resistance to momentum. So that is the kind of the basics of tipping points. So to go into that in a little bit more detail, here's an example that I find quite interesting to think about at the moment, which is looking at these three headlines broadly saying the same thing, which is employers are starting to notice that young people are refusing to work for organizations that don't match their environmental values or don't have particular climate policies. So one of these is saying it's 1 in 4. So it's unclear whether or not how much this is happening, whether this is a tipping point or not, but it's a really interesting example of thinking, well, there seems to be a shift occurring. And thinking, putting yourself in the perspective of an employer, the useful thing to think about here is say someone comes to work for you, but then they decide not to work for you because they don't agree with your values. If you can then turn around and just hire the next person that comes along, then it doesn't matter. Then you kind of tip back down to that original state. But if the next person also says the same thing, or even if it's just 1 in 4 people, then you start to think that, okay, there's a change occurring here. We're going to have to change to meet that new system. And this is where systemic change starts to occur. So this is an interesting example of is this a tipping point? Is this something that we are going to see more and more of? So going back to this slide, is it going to shift us into Basin B, or is it going to at some point going to roll back down the hill? And what is the way that we understand that change? So thinking about that as an example or anything else, what is the resistance that's stopping it from tipping into that new system? And here the system maybe being a world where people won't work for organizations that they think are damaging the planet. What is the resistance to that change? And how do we know when we've tipped over and we're gathering momentum into that new system? So to break it down in a little more detail and explain the framework that we'll be working through later on, that I think is a really useful way to think about the kind of how we want to affect change in a systemic way. This is a way that we can break down that process into 3 different stages. So this first one top left. So this is where we create the conditions for change. So we can't just have this new change emerge out of nothing. We need those conditions to be right so that that system can start to shift. And once we've got those conditions, the next stage is we find the reinforcing feedbacks. So these are the things that use those conditions and make them stronger, make them more impactful, and reduce the resistance of that change. So here, the graphic, you can see that as more people are involved in this process, and it doesn't have to be people, but here as an example, it's shifting up that left-hand side, that first basin, that starting point, so that you can see it's a much flatter route to the new system, so there's much less resistance. So these reinforcing feedbacks are making the change easier and making it have less resistance. And then there's the moment at the end where we have that trigger. So you can see that that state has been pushed up so far that now that rather than facing resistance, that system is now facing momentum to tip into that new state. So that's the trigger, that's the moment, and that's the moment that people tend to focus on. But if you don't have all of the things that went before, then it's unlikely to be successful. So this is the kind of the basic principle of positive tipping points. So to put it into practice, and this is the model that we'll be playing with later on, and seeing how that works, and love to get your feedback on it. But just as some examples to kind of make that feel a bit more tangible, when we think about creating the conditions to change, okay, so what could that mean? So firstly, it could be about the number of people. And you might think, well, the more people, the better. But actually, in some instances, you can see that if there's a smaller population size, it's easier for that change to emerge because it doesn't have to do as much work. So sometimes if you look at a really sort of contained and boundaried population, change can be easier and quicker. It can also be about, do people have access to the information? Is the new system, whether it's technology or a social shift or anything, is it affordable? And that doesn't have to be financial, that could be in terms of time or any other kind of cost. Is it quality? Is it desirable? So again, thinking about the electric vehicle example, does this change feel good? Does it feel better than the current system? Do we see other people doing it? Does it feel like something we want? And is it accessible? Can I actually use this and do this? And if these conditions are met, these are the conditions in which the change can emerge and it can grow. So then we move to the feedback loops. So these, and again, these are just examples. There are more out there, but so one is critical mass. So this is around more people. If you reach a certain percentage of people, or it doesn't have to be people, but a system then can then tip, and then more and more people start doing it. Once you see a critical mass occur, something feels a lot more realistic and it feels a lot more achievable. Economies of scale is the idea that the more we do something, the cheaper it gets. Again, it doesn't have to be financial. Learning by doing is the more we do something, the better at it we get. So these are feedback loops that reinforce, they make whatever those conditions are, they make them stronger. Coordination is a good example. We might be creating these conditions in isolation, but if we can coordinate and come together, those are the opportunities where that change can grow. It can be reinforced and wear down that resistance. And social networks doesn't have to be a literal social network like Facebook or TikTok or anything like that. It can just be how information moves within a community, within a society. And the more that information can move, the quicker that change can occur. And then we can move on to the triggers. So these are the things that can be that moment that if everything else is right, this can trigger a change in the system. So it could be innovation. So it could be a technological innovation or a social innovation, a new policy coming in. It could be about a new behavior change that emerges, or particular investment suddenly comes in. Again, whether it's financial or in terms of capacity, or it could be about new information comes to light. So one example that's often talked about from the UK is David Attenborough's Blue Planet program, which talked about marine plastics. And after that, we saw a huge increase in the interest in banning single-use plastic. A lot of places went plastic free, and certainly down in Cornwall, we've seen a real shift away from plastic straws. So that is just an example of that program is often talked about as the trigger for that behavior, that shift in behavior, that shift in consumption patterns. But we saw the groundwork being laid for that in people understanding about plastics, people caring about the natural world, and people feeling like they could engage their local businesses and their local communities about issues that were important to them. So that trigger was important, but it couldn't have had that change on its own. So last slide. I just want to come back to this idea and just reinforce why it's important that we understand this, why so much work is going into these ideas, because it is such a complex system. So as we said, what can happen is we can overcome that resistance and find that momentum into that new state, that changed system, and that's where we want to get to. But this is not a binary either or, and this is a kind of a 2D representation. But if you imagine this as a 3D model and you roll something to the top of a hill, it could roll down in multiple ways. So we've got A and B here, but C, D, and E are also potential new systems. And so it's really important to think about, we could end up back in A, but we could end up in any of these systems. So it's not just as simple as, okay, well, if we get it to that tipping point, then our work is done. The tipping point is about the old system is changing and a new system is emerging. But it's really important that we think about, what is that new system going to be? How much control do we have over it? So these C, D, and E here represent alternative new states that we could find ourselves. So this is where a system could be co-opted. So if the dominant system realizes it's being replaced, it's trying to dampen that feedback. It's trying to keep things in system A. But if it realizes that actually we're reaching a tipping point, then it might then try and push us towards one of these alternative systems that's still within its own interests. So these might be undesirable. So the better we understand the process, the better we can avoid that from happening. So this is one of the really interesting places we want to explore, is where are those early warning indicators? When do we start to notice when an existing system is losing its stability, or an existing regime? So again, that example of young people starting to change who they want to work for, that might be an example of an early warning indicator. But this can be a really useful way to think about, how is change happening in the system that you want to affect? So it's not just as simple as we're moving from A to B. The better we can understand this process, the better we can really aim to understand change.